Well, welcome to the No Show. My name is Andrea Edwards.
And my name is not Tim Wade. He's actually enjoying a cruise right now. I'm Joe Augustin.
That's next week, right?
Yeah,
next week he's on a cruise.
He's hosting a big leadership event today, and he's going on a cruise. So yeah, we've discussed Tim's social life way in advance. But yeah, my name is Joe Augustin, and welcome to the No Show, which hopefully is a show that leaves you thinking a little bit more about life in general. So we have a great show lined up today. We have some wonderful guests. We have Andrew Milroy, who's rejoining us from last week. He's the founder, of course, of Vector 8, a cybersecurity advisory firm. We also have with us Cathy Johnson, the Authentic Leadership Coach, another repeat offender to the show. Welcome back, Cathy. And our third repeat offender is going to be Susanna Hasenoehrl, the sustainability speaker, and she will be joining us as soon as she's able to after another event that she's currently on as well. So welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me back. I wasn't sure if you would after last week's performance, but it's fantastic to be here.
No, it's all about people who are paying attention and reading the news, and I know you guys do. So, and Susanna certainly has. She's been sharing her reads. Well, not all of them, but it's been a lot going on this week. Have you guys been busy reading or preoccupied with other stuff?
I've read some and been preoccupied, so a little of both.
Same. I've been, but I mean, I'm interested in it. I mean, it's I track the British news pretty closely as well, and obviously there's been a lot on Cop26 in the British news, but yeah, so I've read more about it than I normally would.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, so we're going to focus on COP26 this week. There's obviously loads of other things going on in the world, but it's an important week. I don't think it's the be all and end all, but it is an important week and an indication of, where the global leaders are going. And obviously next week is the week where it focuses more on business and business commitments. So we'll see a lot more coming out from that. And I thought what I could do, what I'd do is just sort of maybe just start with a bit of a sort of a top level summary. Yeah. So the overarching goal of COP26 was ambition, action, acceleration. Don't you love those events? They always have those three words. I used to be pretty good at coming up with the three words. So we went into COP26 on a pathway of 2.7 degrees global warming, which is catastrophic. And the commitments that have been building up over the week were essentially putting us at 2 degrees. But obviously the big commitment that we need is 1.5. But then last night there was a late announcement that the commitments have actually put us at 1.8. However, there's a person called Selwyn Hart. I'm going to presume Selwyn is a male name. And they're a UN Special Advisor and Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change. And he warned the COP delegates that based on the NDCs that have been submitted, and I don't know what NDC stands for, the world is on a 2.7 degree pathway still. So is it 1.8? Is it 2.7? Regardless, it's catastrophic. And basically the message is we're not there yet. It's far too early to celebrate. We haven't achieved what we've set out to achieve, and we've got a long way to go. And I want to remind everyone that 1.5 degrees is when large swathes of the earth will be at will be too hot to live. So things like the food, the people who are getting the rice, they won't be able to be out for significant periods of time during the day because it's too hot to live. If we get to 2 degrees, that's when it's too hot for the rainforests to survive. So every commitment that's made is important, but we know that they're non-binding. And historically, all of these commitments that have been made in the past, they haven't met them, and they've skyrocketed past them. But anyway, we have got Susanna with us, so I'm going to bring her in. Hello, Susanna.
And hello,
Susanna, everyone.
As well, just so you know that NDC is nationally determined contributions.
Thank you very much. All right. So the whole point of COP26 is all about keeping fossil fuels in the ground. George Manabo quoted a study in Nature, which is a scientific journal, and that says to stand a 50% chance of avoiding 1.5 to 5 degrees of global heating, we need to retire 89% of proven coal reserves, 58% of oil reserves, and 59% of fossil methane, so natural gas reserves. If we want to have better odds than 50-50, we basically need to leave them all in the ground. And then, of course, the World Meteorological Organization also announced this week that heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have reached record highs in 2020, despite the pandemic, and they are rising again this year. So that's kind of setting the tone for what we went in with. First impressions, guys. Big takeaway. Something that caught your attention. Favorite speech.
Yeah, I think if we look at the weekend before Cop26 started, the G20 meeting in Italy left quite a bit of a void in terms of leadership. I think it's not entirely, unexpected, but certainly there would have been room for a strong leader or a group of leaders, maybe out of the 20, to come forward and make stronger statement to be followed, of course. But it was fairly compromise-driven, in my view, setting a tone and leaving a lot more work to be accomplished by others, if you ask me.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, what jumped out at me was, the world's largest polluter and by far the world's largest carbon emitter. The leader of that country wasn't present. It was a relatively junior delegation, so talking specifically about China here. Yeah. And that's, somewhat demoralizing, because a lot of the intentions that China has talked about from a environmental perspective often sound very positive, but they're talking about becoming stopping using coal in 2060 or something like that, which is just a depressing thought, right? Because we have what we need now. We have the technology to make the shift in a very short period of time. So I don't quite understand why some countries just feel that they need to go through the same process that some other countries did some years ago in order to reach what might be described as a developed, state. It's just surprising me, because the other thing about China is it's categorized as a developing country, which gives it more flexibility with, Susanna, correct me if I'm wrong, around some of the agreements that come out. And I'm not saying it's just China. I mean, there's a lot of people that are culpable here. But that was what kind of jumped out to me, that Xi Jinping wasn't present, and not even his immediate leadership around him.
But then again, it's been commented in the past days that, China has a plan, somewhat detailed already, and that they saw no need for the kind of show and tell, circus in a way that, Glasgow also has been described as, G20 perhaps a bit less. But there's certainly a lot of, showing up and greenwashing as well happening at Glasgow, unfortunately. So will that bring us the results? Just keep us busy.
And then we had Biden speaking out about China and Russia, and it's like, come on, guys, this backfighting, it's like that's not what's going to get us where we need to go. And maybe the whole COVID argument for China and Russia was valid, but the divisions that we're seeing developing in the world. We've talked about China sort of shrinking back and sort of closing up its borders. None of it's good, but China's got well over 1 billion people to take care of. And I was just reading another article, not China, but North Korea are facing one of their most severe famines, because they're at 1.9 degrees. For some reason, they're heating faster than everywhere else, but they're already being severely impacted. And of course, they're on the border with China. So you've got to start thinking, the impact is here. It's happening. It's now. So it's not like China can ignore the climate crisis, right? The floods that are happening in their mines, so they can't get their own coal out. And what's going on?
Big picture, one thing that I've been holding this week is this whole idea of politics around everything. And the truth is, China, they can just decide what they're going to do, and they're going to do it. Biden can't get his bill through Congress, being stopped by someone from his own party. Yeah. And the question for the U.S. is, or for me, is even if Biden were to get something through, who's the next person coming and what will they do? It's just after the dramatic shift with Trump, it's that part is scary to me.
Yeah, especially with the governor of Virginia, was it? That being a shock Republican victor.
Yeah.
I mean, based on the Republican Party we've got right now, we can't afford to have those guys back in power anytime soon.
That was one thing I was watching, but the only good thing about that is he distanced himself from Trump. So he won it by distancing himself from Trump. Or bad, even if you're a Trump supporter, maybe it's a bad thing. But
it's a good point.
He distanced himself. And by distancing himself from Trump, he managed, and maybe all this narrative about stolen elections and election fraud and will go away, and they'll start to realize that they can potentially win elections based on policies.
But if you look at what kind of treatment Munching is getting whenever he is appearing in public, I mean, the youth are after him and really confronting him with slogans like "I want to live" and so on. I think the more people do that, the more power people will eventually have. I mean, this cannot be completely ignored by him.
And the next election, for the first time, the millennials will dominate the voting cycle. So, if the players in politics aren't switched on to the changing demographics from a voting perspective and the power balance, I think they're gonna miss a key trick. They're used to appealing to the boomers, but the boomers are now finally shrunk. Do you know by 2028, for the first time, my generation, Generation X, who's Generation X here? All of us?
Yeah, I'll fess up to that.
Yeah, but in 2028, it will be the first time that we will have more voting power than our parents. Don't you think that's amazing?
Yeah.
Well, it's been a thing for a lot of things. I mean, even the entertainment industry has always been bogged down by the whole, the older age vote. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the rest of the world in terms of climate change and economics.
Yeah. But that's one area that gives me hope. So I know a lot of people are going to listen to this and go, "There's no hope." The story that I was really listening to and really interested in was the $100 billion pledge to developing countries, which has not come to pass, and they're basically saying now it won't happen until 2023. And you heard people like Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. Susanna, thanks for drawing my attention to her. She was fabulous.
Brilliant.
But basically what the developing countries, so I don't know if you guys know the history of that $100 billion pledge. It was a number that Hillary Clinton put out there a number of years ago when she was Secretary of State. And then everyone said, okay, we'll do that. But actually the maths of the cost were never sort of really factored in. Anyway, none of the money's come through anyway. And Modi stood up and said, okay, you guys want me to get my number down to net zero before 2070, I need $1.3 trillion. And all of the other developing countries are also coming up. And to me, that's a really big part of the story, that the governments and the businesses that have created the problem have got to pay the cost of the problem. And that's the bit that we just don't ever seem to, see a conclusion on. So, because if our countries don't pay, it's going to cost more in the long run. But equally, it's going to create a lot more challenges for all of us, like billions of climate refugees that we're going to have to sort out, right?
I don't understand why, in order to develop, you need to use 19th century technology. I mean, I don't understand that part of it, because the technology is around to just leapfrog it. I mean, I can understand maybe investment is required in order to use more renewables in Indonesia and the developing world and so forth, but I really don't quite get why it's seen as a necessity for this huge amount of pollution to take place without massive transfers of wealth.
Well,
because we can very easily get away from it. It's not that difficult.
Well, I was listening to someone. Sorry, Susanna, you go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry to jump in. Well, if we talk a little bit about energy in particular, and it's clear that we cannot save ourselves from the climate unless we transform the energy sector in a very significant way. I mean, about 3/4 of all the greenhouse gas emissions today go back to the energy sector. Yeah. And an investor group here in Asia has calculated that to become 1.5 degrees compliant, Asia is going to need 37 trillion USD investment into changing the energy system here over the next 30 years. Now, it is a significant sum, even if renewable energies are very competitive. So wind, solar, but we also need better transmission networks, storage. So yeah, we do need money. But then again, what really bothers me in some of these conversations is that, yes, this pledge has been made, and I do think that it's, it also makes sense. But then again, you've got these countries like Indonesia who's saying, "Oh, give me the money, but by the way, I won't change anything." They signed the deforestation agreement, but the following day said that, "Oh, this must not hinder our palm oil business," anyway, or things like that.
Susanna, is the dirty technology being funded as well? Because somebody must be funding the non-renewable power infrastructure as well, right? So can't that somehow be transferred?
Well, that is actually one of the key topics, a little bit of the white elephant in the room, but many international organizations are calling for the end of fossil fuel subsidies. So the International Monetary Fund actually just released a new number, and a staggering $5.9 trillion went into fossil fuel subsidies in 2020. Now, this number has been also contested by many people, climate denials and so on. And I do need to say that out of that 5.9 trillion USD, only 7% were direct fuel subsidies, and the other subsidies were in the forms of what are the different costs that societies need to pay because of all the negative impacts of air pollution and fossil fuel combustion. But the bill of fossil fuel subsidies, the global GDP was about 85 trillion, and 5.9 of that was subsidies paid to fossil fuel companies in different shapes and forms.
But and the other thing is, it sort of underpins the global economy. There's another piece that came out this week. I'm sure you've seen it. In fact, Susanna, you might have shared a version of it that's talking about the end of the fossil fuel industry is going to create a global financial crisis like we experienced in 2008. Did you guys read that one?
No, I
didn't. They're sort of in the 2036 range. So basically the companies that are going to be stuck with the assets and the fuel assets, they're going to be in big financial trouble. But like California during the pandemic almost went bankrupt because people weren't buying fuel, so the taxes weren't being paid, which underpins the state. And so there's this other whole economic web that sort of links it all around the world. But then you see what OPEC's doing at the moment and holding the world to ransom. You see Russia's playing games with gas in Europe, right?
Yeah, I know technology. Sorry, Susanna.
Sorry, yeah. Just on that topic of the so-called carbon bubble, it's not really a new topic, but good to have some more research on it again. So a new peer-reviewed study just came out which said that there are actually 11 trillion fossil fuel assets, lots of coal assets and also gas that could cause 2008 style financial crisis. And actually a lot of those, especially coal, are here in Asia. And if you look at the stock market exposure, 90% of the coal stock assets are parked in Asian stock markets. So Mumbai has an exposure to coal of 58 billion USD, Japan 22, Manila 6.3, and KL $6.2 billion. So this is for sure a real problem, and that's why the Asian Development Bank is also about to embark on programs where they would actually buy this, dirty assets, coal plants, and so on, and basically retire them early. avoid a financial crisis.
No.
I mean, there's a bit of an analogy, Andrea, that you'll be familiar with, and those of you in the technology industry. Well, I don't know if it applies perfectly, but certainly in technology, we talk about having paradigm shifts, right? Significant shifts in the way we do business, the way we consume, and it's very disruptive, right? And it happens, every 15 years or so? And then the industry moves along with that. Now, again, I'm not an expert in the utilities industry and the power industry, but we've known I think I mentioned the last one. In 1979, my parents bought me David Attenborough's Life on Earth that talked about global warming, deforestation, the ozone layer, et cetera, et cetera. We knew all about it then. In the 80s, there were attempts to address a lot of those challenges. So the elimination, CFCs going, and perhaps that was because only a small number of countries in the world actually produced CFCs at the time, right? So you were dealing with a much smaller constituency to address these things. Now it's a much bigger one. But I guess my question is, we've known about it, we know what to do. There's money in it, right? So a lot of the the renewable energy companies are doing very well in the stock markets and so on. So and I know there are vested interests in the old world, but the same in technology, right? There was vested interest in staying on premise and not moving into the cloud, but eventually those vested interests had to give up and shift. So what is holding back the oil and let's say maybe the energy sector from transforming in that way? It's got everything it needs to transform. There is money to be made.
Yeah. It's the big question, right?
What is stalling it? We've known for 30 years. And actually, you look at
30 years,
50 years, right? You look at some countries in Western Europe, for example. I mean, and I know there's lots of reasons for the UK, but I just shared something saying the UK's carbon emissions have gone down 38% since the early 90s. I know a lot of European countries have had substantial decreases in their carbon, footprint since it became, a political issue. Probably in the late 80s, it became a major political issue. Maybe in Germany, some other European country that was even earlier, right? So what is it that's blocking it? I don't quite get it, because you can say vested interest, but there were vested interests in certain aspects of technology we shifted. You can say political will. Well, we've been talking about this politically for years, right? What is it that's blocking it?
Well, I mean, if I give you a tech answer, I'll just say two words or one word, depending on how you look at the word: mainframes. I mean, look, we still have mainframes. We still have banks that have them. They've been around for way too long.
True.
And what you said just now, how you describe this vested interest, right? So that I think traditional fuel sources, coal, gas, they all have very much vested interests. I was listening to someone from Poland the other day, just today actually, and they're just talking about how they can't get off of coal as quickly as everybody wants them to, because there is so much that is entrenched there. It is really a massive thing to try to unwind. I mean, it's very easy on the outside to look in and say, okay, we can change this in a moment. And I know that, I mean, for me, I've been thinking we need to hit the emergency brake on this, definitely, right? But it's also not quite as easy as all that, because there's lots of stuff that's relying on the way things are sort of still working. We were talking about using an old technology, 19th century technology. I'm about to go and pick up my wife in a piece of 19th century technology that's developed somewhat. It's still going to be a car. There's some things that continue somehow to work despite the cost, and we really have to get to the point where the cost is just so high. We say, you know what, we're going to stop using that.
No, I don't want to. Sorry, Andrea.
No, I think another thing is power. And, I think it's really hard for us. Like, I'm totally with you, Andy. You sort of sit there, and the CEO of a petroleum company has children and grandchildren. So it's not like they're not human, right? But so how can they be so detached? And, you talk about, we've known about it for 30 years, 50 years. The oil and gas industry has known about it since the 50s, probably even longer. The documented proof is from the 50s. The automotive industry has known about it from the 70s, documented proof. But I think it's a power thing. And, so many of the greenwashing conversations we've had, the algae from Exxon, and they showed the data that's being spent on the R&D into working out how to turn algae into fuel versus the marketing spend of the company convincing us that we're responsible for climate change. I mean, it's just a joke, It's like
the tobacco industry, Andrea, just to jump in, the tobacco industry, that managed to get dealt with in a relatively short period of time. It still exists.
Well, interestingly, right now there is the congressional hearing in the US where all the big oil and gas company CEOs, both from US as well as from Europe, are testifying. And I've shared it with a few people, but I think this kind of proceeding might actually have a bigger impact on the planet than whatever happens at Glasgow. If this becomes the next tobacco moment, it might be quite powerful.
Yeah,
we shall see.
That's part of how tobacco got there.
Yeah, but the tobacco argument's an interesting one because people use it a lot to compare one with the other. But countries America mainly, when they sort of stood up and challenged the tobacco industry, that's a local problem, right? Their people are dying. It's costing the state to sort of, dealing with the health and wellness of its people. So I get that. And I think the environment, the whole climate crisis, I don't think they expected it to happen as quickly. I don't think they expected the ramifications to happen so fast. And, this last decade, the development that's gone on around the world, or the last 2 decades, I think it's escalated the crisis so quickly, and it's beyond anyone's imagination of how fast everything was going to turn around, and the tipping points that have been passed and the tipping points that have been close. So I think they've all been sort of caught not unawares. They knew what was coming, but I don't think anyone expected it as quickly. Like if you look at the rising middle class in the last decade, it's just astronomical. And it was predicted by the World Economic Forum that it was going to be one of the greatest cataclysmic shifts in human history. And most of that rise has happened in Asia. So I think it's the speed that has caught everyone by surprise. But I don't know why we haven't. And is it just cost? Is it lack of will? Is it ignorance? Is it because the greenwashing? They believe it. Is it the media? Is it Rupert Murdoch?
Who might have that answer? Might be psychologists or neuroscientists at the end of the day. Because if you look at this rationally, there's really no.
Well, I'm going to throw in a kind of
ration this, right? You've got children, grandchildren. It's just not rational. But, we know that with fossil fuel, power is very unequally distributed. We have a handful of countries today that contribute the most of the fossil fuels. And then again, some hundreds or dozens or hundreds of companies that distribute fossil fuels. And in the US alone, the US oil and gas companies made something like $2 trillion in profits in since the Paris Target Agreement. Not quite that, but in a fairly short period of time. And ultimately, it's quite a small number of people who profit from fossil fuel, especially if you contrast that with renewable energy. Anyone can put a solar panel on their rooftop. This is a power fight. Once you no longer need that fossil fuel fix, you are liberated to a degree. And those companies, those people lose their power, also over politicians.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's where the money goes, right? That's how they become politicians.
So, Andrea, to your point, I think your one about speed's a great one, because I don't think anybody expected China or India, some other developing countries, to shift from being basically agrarian economies to what you might describe as, I guess you describe as industrialized economies today, right? Into industrialized economies in such a short space of time. And those countries have got huge populations, and obviously with huge demands and requirements from an energy perspective. I don't think anybody expected it to be anything like that quick. Like some of the statistics that come out of China, for example, the number of people who've moved into the cities from the countryside, where presumably in the countryside their energy use would have been relatively low, much higher in the city in such a short time frame.
Yeah, just going from bicycles.
So nobody expected that, you're right, in such a short period of time.
So you've seen the photos of Beijing where everyone was on bicycles in the 1990s to cars. And now, they've got their own domestic market now. So it's not, they've built their economy on the back of making cheap shit to send around the world. Let's be honest, right?
Which we buy.
And we buy it, rebuy it. And now they've developed their own domestic economy, which actually gives them a different way of playing the game. But, our consumer habits, fast furniture for me is one of the ones that drives me absolutely crazy. But we all go out and we actively buy it, and we upgrade our dining tables every couple of years, where it used to be something you'd pass down from family to family. And,
that's right.
and we're constantly doing it. The Christmas tree trend of every year you have a different color, and these people are buying these cheap, crappy plastic decorations, and then they're throwing them out and getting another round for the next year's theme. So we've all bought into this thing that sort of just, we're all responsible. We're all part of this game. But but that's how China grew. But I think its domestic growth is, to me, probably one of the most interesting parts of the story. They've moved beyond relying on our money to
not just China. It's much of the so-called developing world. I'm not sure if that's the right way of describing them, but officially, countries with the GDP that are outside the OECD, is that right, are typically described as developing countries, right?
Yeah.
So, but there's a lot of them have moved very fast. India too, right?
Thailand,
1 billion plus people. Yeah, Thailand, astonishing, right? Indonesia.
Yeah.
Well,
so still keeping.
Sorry, no, you go, Susanna.
Yeah, just keeping things in perspective, and also concerning the announcement of India to reach climate neutrality by 2070, which is being both applauded and criticized at the same time. Just to bring things into perspective, today the per capita CO2 footprint in India is about 2 tons per person. I've seen different kinds of numbers, plus minus, but this is just a small percentage of our carbon footprint in I would say in the developed economies, if you like. US 16.6 tons per person. I think Australia is close to that. Singapore is 8.8 tons per person, I think. So again, once we criticize such companies and such countries and their pledges and plans, let's keep these things in our mind as well.
When I visited Delhi's Garbage Mountain, have you guys heard of?
Sorry.
Have you heard of the Garbage Mountains? So always hiding in the non-Roman environment. So there's one in Delhi and there's one in Mumbai, and they have a light on top of them to stop planes from crashing into them. So these landfills are so huge.
Sorry, Andrew, I just wanted to immediately follow up on what Susanna was saying. An optimistic perspective, a lot of the Western European countries have managed to lower their per capita carbon footprint significantly, right, since the 1990s, which is
because manufacturing moved to China, right? So if
lot of it, there was stuff. Some of it was union related. So in the UK, a lot of it was to do with the government attacking the coal mining industry, right? There was some issues about feeling that the coal industry had too much control over power, but nevertheless, there was a shift in power, the way power is generated in some countries, France too, right?
The EU, when there was a recent report of what each country or region's on track for. The EU was on track for 3.7, based on the way it runs. England was about 2.7, so the EU is actually still very high. But what I was saying with the garbage in India, the individual person's output of garbage compared to an American, and I can't remember the exact stats, but the average Indian is tiny versus the American, which is like 15 times higher. So you're absolutely right. It's just a scale. It's a population. But like, we can't have, if every single person in India and China started to behave the way that we behave, we're in trouble, right?
Yeah, but still, I really want to reject the population growth argument, which is quite popular among climate change deniers as well. They're like, "Oh, there's too many people on this planet. We can't support that." And it's the, I would say, the countries with most added people that will be the culprits. But then again, if we look at the footprint of our consumption, it's the first world, if we can still use that term, that consumes by factor X what these people in the so-called developing world are consuming. So I absolutely reject the population growth
Absolutely.
argument in this context.
And let me assure you, that's not an argument I was making, because I
I know.
agree with you.
But just for the sake of pushing this, what's the China per capita footprint? Because I know China's quite high, and I don't think it should be categorized as a developing country anymore partly for that reason. China's
Sorry,
is 10.
I don't have that on my mind.
Yeah,
but,
so it's quite high. It's not. It's
yeah.
it's certainly higher than most of Western Europe.
Yeah. All right, Joe, before we go, I want to go into a couple of the key announcements that were made. Joe, Cathy, do you want to jump in with anything?
Not at this stage. Go ahead.
No? All right. So, sorry, Cathy.
Just the output from the COP you're talking about, or what? Just news?
Anything you want to jump in on we've been talking about?
There were a couple of articles that I really, really loved. One was about Denmark, which I really wasn't so aware that they had done so much, and really looking at getting consensus in a way that worked. And I don't know, it was fascinating to me, and making it market-based partnerships where people are actually working together, government, civic, and the private sector, which was interesting. And I also just loved the speech by the PM of Barbados. I think having enough speakers like you, Susanna, who are speaking passionately about this, at some point it has to break through.
Yeah.
I don't know. That was my 2 cents.
Thank
We'll
you.
see.
I'm hoping so.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
Well,
So let's go into. Sorry, Joe.
So I was just going to say, just in case I run out of time before I had to leave, there was one thing I thought about quite a bit about this particular meeting. And it was basically about how if there was one meeting that we actually should have had on Zoom, it should have been Cop26. I mean, it's the number of planes and cars running and engines and chauffeurs next to them just waiting for someone to show up. It's just one of the great ironies, right? So just earlier on when you were talking about China, and I thought the greatest contribution that's been made so far is the China delegation not showing up.
But then again, let's not forget about the human factor. I was actually thinking about this myself the other day, because there's all these negative posts about people flying there in private jets. But let's face it, there are lots of people who are working very, very hard to save ourselves, and who've been doing that behind the Zoom for 2 years or so, like many of us have. But just to give them the chance to meet in person, connect with other people, this can actually make a difference, I think, in terms of keeping ourselves motivated, energized, and to carry on the work.
I agree. Sometimes you've got to meet face to face, and there's an environmental cost, but it's a cost that you need to pay sometimes, right? All right. So some of the announcements, let's just go through them. So the first one is on coal. So it is considered the single biggest contributor to climate change, and more than 40 countries signed the agreement the pledge to quit coal. And this included coal-using countries like Poland, Vietnam, and Chile. But the Chinese and the US did not sign up to this. But there was a separate commitment that 20 countries, which include the US, have pledged to end public financing for what they call unabated fossil fuel projects abroad by the end of 2022. And so this is where they're going to get, where they're digging for fossil fuels, coal, natural oil, natural gas, but they're not using the technology to capture the emissions in the process. So that's what that announcement is all about. So, the media we're moving in the right direction. We're getting ready to seal, coal's fate, those sort of comments. But Greenpeace, who I was often reading the announcements and then reading Greenpeace's take, and they said it still feels far short of the ambition that's needed on fossil fuels in this decade. And of course, the small print gives everyone who signed that enormous leeway to do whatever they want, or to not do what they agreed with. So, what did you guys pick up from a coal perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the decisive things that would have been needed would have been a a broader support for the end of coal. There's still lots of loopholes there, although it's very clear it's the dirtiest form of energy. So again, I think what I expect from COP26 is some advances and some things that we're stuck with. So this is one of those things that is kind of positive and negative at the same time.
It was frustrating.
A stronger agreement would have been better, obviously, and giving a lot of impetus for a faster transition.
Yeah. No, I found it really frustrating. Of course, countries like Australia, which dig up coal and send it overseas, and basically have anchored their entire economy on what they dig up. I just, I think for people in Australia who are voting for these politicians, they're putting their economy on the line, and it's going to happen quickly. This isn't in the long term. So, yeah, I didn't feel very proud of being an Australian during COP26. I can say that much.
Well, it's still happening, right? It's not over. Yeah.
No, but the political bit of it, and they haven't shown any willing, as far as I've seen. Anyone else on the coal front?
Just it's one of those again where there's such infrastructure and investment and property. It's at least the U.S. I'm sure it's the same for Australia. There's if that were to be cut off, there would be a huge backlash, and I think there aren't so many people in the U.S. who are knowledgeable enough about climate change to vote for whoever is cutting it off, as opposed to, they're making some of our people lose their jobs.
Yeah,
again, I don't know. I've been sort of really obsessed with politics this week, but that's the sad part.
Everyone on this planet, especially in the developing world or the developed world, needs to understand that we have to make great sacrifices if we have any chance of moving forward. We have to change how we live, how we spend, how we consume. We have to change it all. And until the people in these countries can get fair information to understand really what's at stake, they're not going to be in a position to be able to understand that they've got to vote for the people who are going to take care of all versus just taking care of themselves and securing their own idea of their future, because otherwise everyone's future is basically screwed.
I
think the only silver lining in this is that coal is no longer competitive cost-wise. So solar and wind in most cases are much cheaper. So it's really mostly the subsidies that are keeping coal still burning, and obviously it's about jobs as well in China, in Australia, also in Poland. But so fair adjustment mechanisms are needed. I don't see a coal exit happening without that, because people will revolt and are revolting. So hence the importance of the fair adjustment.
Susanna, do you think it's going to drive the nuclear power industry all of this? Do you think nuclear power is going to, it looks to me like a lot of countries are starting to look at nuclear power more than they were some years ago. Obviously, there's a lot of concerns around it, but do you think we'll see a significant move to nuclear as well as, I think potentially less dangerous renewables?
Well, based on the price of uranium, the move is happening already.
It's quite divided. Many countries are just principally opposed to that because of historic events or other things. What I hear from Japan is that actually what triggered a big environmental consciousness was the Fukushima catastrophe. They still have atom energy. I think they will have some more as well, but still overall, I think people experience and actually such a catastrophe made them much more aware of their natural surroundings. Most of the nuclear power plants that are in operation today are actually quite old technology, because many countries didn't invest into that, like Germany and so on. So there are kind of new generation nuclear plants coming up. Bill Gates is one of the advocates for them. I'm not really the expert on the topic, but what is a disadvantage of nuclear that is much more costly and slow to build than renewable energy. You know, solar power, wind farms can be built up in weeks or months, whereas nuclear plants, at least this current generation, they take years and years and years. And what we don't have is much time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with Bill Gates' nuclear facilities, they were going to be built in China, and then when Trump got in, that all got cancelled. The other issue with nuclear is the waste it's created. And I think Bill Gates did come up with a solution with the waste, but there are piles of waste. I think New Mexico's got one of them that nobody knows what to do with it. So to create nuclear energy, they have to actually create it using the waste to generate the energy. So it's a big messy one.
Yeah, if we come back to the power game, you've got countries like France or Finland that generate a lot of their energy demands with nuclear, and now with the whole fossil fuel and LNG gas prices going up. They're obviously like, hey, this was a great strategy. We love it when we're not dependent on these few countries for the supply of energy. I mean, there's something in that as well, but. I don't think it necessarily has to be nuclear.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wish everyone a good rest of the session here. I have to run to the next thing I'm doing, which is ironically something to do with Cop26 as well. I just want to leave you with an idea that I've been thinking about, as in like the problem I think we face with a lot of energy issues is that we don't have the outhouse in the house. I think if you're able to bring that problem sort of or the effects of what happens into closer proximity to people, they can begin to behave a bit differently. I think it's because someone who's consuming energy derived from coal doesn't see it, feel it. There's no connection at all. And that's really it. I think if we can try to figure that out, and I think that's a communication problem. I've always thought that the arts would be a way to solve the problem. The artists need to find a way to make that visceral. They need to make it so that it gets uncomfortable to do the wrong thing.
Interesting. I visited the what do you call them? The incinerators in Phuket yesterday, and I didn't go inside, but I'm talking to them about setting up tours for tourists to go and visit the facilities. So face your waste. So standing under that mountain in New Delhi, facing that waste was unbelievable. And I think if we can face our waste, we can face, like we're breathing in the, particular pollutants from all of this, but we just can't see them. So any opportunity to see what we're doing, I think would be very powerful.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway, good luck, Joe.
Thank you very much, you guys.
See you, Joe.
Bye, Joe.
Just one other. I mean, Susanna, you might you added some insights into this, but with renewables, so with wind, with solar, with tidal, what the big challenge at the moment is storage. Is that right? It's storing it, because obviously it's wind, you're not constantly producing the wind power, because there'll be periods of time where it's not sufficiently windy, right? Well, I guess it depends.
Storage and transmission, because the energy generation is not necessarily happening where you need all that, right?
Mm-hmm. But it's moving, right? So the storage technology is moving fast.
Well, it's one of the areas that is getting a lot of investment right now, because it's been clearly identified as one of the critical technologies, and I think it's progressing very well. But what is obviously a bit more challenging from a kind of political perspective is transmission, because you actually need potentially build more like transmission lines, like to actually transport the renewable energy from A to B. And for instance, Malaysia has said that they're not going to do that for Singapore. To transmit renewable energy from Malaysia to Singapore. I guess they want to keep it all for themselves, right? Yeah. So this becomes another different political game again, unless the country has that kind of capacity.
I'm just curious as to. I mean, obviously, it's all very gloomy, what we hear, politically, and a lot of, the way the world seems to be moving from an environmental perspective at the moment. But I'm just trying to think, again, trying to put a slightly more positive spin on it, will there be a technology tipping point, do you think, that'll make the rush to renewables faster, like advancements in storage technology? Because there is a move, all right, to renewables, but it's not fast.
Yeah. So I think with solar, instead of a tipping point, it's been a steady declining curve in terms of cost. I mean, solar energy, the panels used to be very, very expensive. They have come down a lot every year, something like, I don't know, 92% in 10 years or something like that. The exact number in my mind. And that's still continuing. With wind, it's not quite the same, but all the time these things are, very steadily becoming, much more affordable. And wind and solar are definitely very competitive already in terms of the power generation itself. In terms of battery storage, right? Sorry.
But the investment as well, right? That's one of the things that's been struggling. The governments haven't been investing in this technology. They're
not enough.
Subsidizing the fossil fuels. So as soon as the direction turns and the money gets focused where it needs to go, and then the battery storage to move energy around the world, or do we have pipelines? Those sort of things. There's no agreement yet that I've seen where a path has been determined. So, but the focus needs to absolutely move in that direction.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenges are political ones, actually. Creating the right, environment for the investments to flow in. I mean, it's flowing at a certain level, but more is needed.
Yeah. If you see the future map of the world when we go through significant warming, the mainland of Australia, apart from a little bit of green above Perth, they're expecting it to be covered in solar panels. So Australia will basically be an energy producer with solar panels that will then be captured and shipped around the world. But basically, Tasmania and Perth is pretty much the only parts of Australia that will continue to be livable. So
really,
it's pretty amazing when you look at the potential outcomes. All right, so the next one is the methane reduction commitment, and this was definitely something I was paying attention to because it's the easiest thing to do. It gets the quickest results, and it buys us time, right? So that's always been the case. But before it even began, the Australian rejected the US and EU call for a global methane agreement. But this was announced that they would cut greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030. More than 100 countries have signed up, and Russia, China, and India are not part of this pledge. All commitments are obviously voluntary, but like I said, it's just basically reducing methane buys us time. So it's an important one. I think there's a lot of people that might not know about methane, but it's one of the gases that has increased exponentially, and they believe that it contributes a significant punch when it comes to the rapid warming that we've seen in recent years. So, you guys looking into the methane side?
Very much so. Actually, I think when you say that it has increased dramatically, I believe there's some truth in that, but also our ability to detect methane leaks have increased, improved a lot. So we actually now have satellite technology that can detect bigger methane leaks from the space, whereas previously we were relying on infrared cameras quite nearby sites where leaks were expected, and with those infrared cameras you cannot even estimate the volume accurately. So you really need the satellite technology for that. Sorry, something going on with my light here. But yeah, of course, apart from industrial gas production, drilling, and all that,
fracking.
It's cows that produce methane. So there's something that we can all do something about by reducing our beef consumption, also other ruminants. Although what's also a bit of I would say, misunderstanding is that people often think all cattle farming is the same, which is not true. So if you actually have cattle, living in more natural environments, grass-fed and so on, they actually produce far less methane overall, not just through the enteric fermentation, but because of they also work their manure back into the soil where it acts as a natural fertilizer. And there are also now some upcoming fertilizers industrially produced, but also like sort of kelp plants that actually reduce the enteric fermentation in the cows. But still, my point is, this is something where we all can do something. Yeah.
So one of the things that Greenpeace said was that they basically they let big agriculture off the hook. And I know this is one of your areas, Susanna, but getting commitments to changing diets, so meat, more plant-based, but also things like rice fields, the way rice fields are managed, that there's a way for that to be managed so that it doesn't release methane. So there's a lot of different aspects to it. But the other thing is us all composting. Let's stop organic material going into rubbish tips. So we've got a big part to play. But there's the bigger story. And fracking, they think, is one of the reasons why it's increased so dramatically in recent years as well. But this is important because methane can dissipate within 10 years, whereas CO2 sort of hangs around in the atmosphere for hundreds or thousands of years. So if we can cut it, and I think there is 900 let me find it. There's 900 or 9,000. It's important that I say the right one. Oil fields in the US, I can't find it, which are leaking methane. But basically, if anything's happened to these, it's since 2015. The companies are responsible for these oil fields, but before 2015, nobody's responsible. So there's all these oil fields in the US just leaking methane, and they just need to be plugged, but nobody's taking responsibility for it. Some of them aren't even owned by oil companies anymore. They go back, to the beginning. So there's all these this leaking methane everywhere, and 40% of methane is produced from the natural world. So it's not all from us, but 60% is from us now. Let me find that number.
Yeah, and one problem associated with that, or one big risk coming our way, is that as I would say the big oil and gas company to start to divest, they sell their wells to some other parties who are perhaps not so big and not so much under public scrutiny. Yeah, who's then overseeing what happens to those wells? I mean,
the contracts, those sort of companies, not just the oil and gas companies, but the contracts that they sign, and trust me, I've seen some of them, are absolutely horrifying. Okay, so it wasn't 9,000, it's 900,000 sites in the US.
Wow.
Are basically unregulated, and nobody's fixing them, and nobody's paying attention. And there are people obviously trying desperately to plug up all these holes, but 900,000 sites sit outside this 2015 agreement.
Yeah, what's also been identified as fair adjustment mechanisms is that instead of drilling new oil wells, let's get the skilled people to seal these wells properly. Obviously, someone needs to pay, but could actually have a good use for all these people that should no longer be employed in new exploration.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the payment of the job, because nobody's taking ownership, and that's the big problem. Yeah. So it's an interesting side of the story to dig into if you're interested in it.
One thing though about this methane agreement that we should keep paying attention to is it's actually the execution of it. Obviously, as of now, the 30% reduction does not actually apply per country. So there is that kind of loophole again to say, so the parties who signed it have committed to jointly reduce the methane emissions by 30%, not by country. So accountability and further collaboration in that field, further agreements will be critical.
Yeah. But we all have a part to play. About 8% of methane emissions are on us and the way we consume and get rid of our waste. So we can contribute, and I think we should be all starting to step up into that.
And one really important thing here in Asia, where a lot of rice is eaten, rice is, what is it? Well, half of the agricultural methane emissions, if I'm not mistaken. But, let's not waste white rice. Let's not waste rice at all. It's a pity if we do that. Yeah.
All right. Anything to add? The next big deal was Deforestation Commitment. So more than 100 world leaders have promised to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. And my first reaction is, why are we waiting a decade? Yeah. Really? Why? Yeah. I mean, it just drives me nuts. And Greenpeace again, Bolsonaro from Brazil, he's very comfortable signing this because he's got another decade of destruction. And, the Amazon cannot survive another decade of what's been going on. In 2020, deforestation in the Amazon reached an all-time high. So, we just, we can't do it.
I mean,
and then, of course, the Indonesia, they've walked back from it.
It's another depressing one because it's something, again, we've known about for so long. Yeah. But it's this link between development and deforestation that, again, is the issue. It's just, when I was kind of alluding to a little bit earlier, that there seems to be a sense that in order to develop, you've got to use dirty, non-renewable fuel and you've got to deforest, which is what the rich countries did a long time ago, right? Or at least the smaller ones, certainly Western Europe. Again, if you use the UK as an example, there's hardly any. It used to be a forested country. There's hardly any left. So there's this kind of assumption that for Indonesia, for example, I think one of the ministers got up and said, "Look, development's our priority. We've signed this, but development's our priority." So this assumption that in order to develop, you've got to deforest, somehow that link needs to be broken. Which I think is a bit of an issue. I think the Brazilians tried to get onto that. I know in a pre-Bolsonaro government was much more focused on the rights of the indigenous people and looking at ways in which they could protect the forest and so forth. But that seems to have somewhat fallen by the wayside in recent years. So it's somehow breaking that link, I think, is between development and deforestation. Why can you only develop and deforest by destroying your environment?
Yeah.
How we'll come to that, I'm not sure.
But the good news is Brazil did sign. They didn't sign last time, and Russia and China signed as well. So it's not all bad. And there was also a pledge of 14 billion in public and private funding to support it. So
2030 is too far out. I mean, it's got to stop now.
Yeah.
When you look at, it's very depressing just in the time I've been here and knowing Indonesia and just seeing the rate of deforestation. Forested places like Sumatra with virtually nothing left, and obviously Borneo, both the Malaysian and Indonesian part of Borneo are been deforested at a frightening rate, and the capital city of Indonesia is moving there.
Yeah, right.
It's not the first time this kind of agreement has been made. No. So I'm wondering what's going to be different now. But then again, we also broaden the perspective. You look at Europe or whatever. I mean, Europe also, a long time ago though, but cleared most of its forest, right? And I do see the argument of these countries saying, hey, why should we be the lung of the world? And of course there have been compensation efforts earlier, like Norway pledged to pay Indonesia $1 billion. I think some money was transferred, but that agreement was just actually cancelled. I don't know all the details, but probably quite problematic in execution. So what's going to be different now? I'm not quite sure.
Susanna, is it necessary?
I hope for the best.
Is it necessary now in 2021 for a country that seeks to, is development the right word, for a country that seems to make the quality of life of its citizens better? Is it necessary to go through the same process as the European countries went through? I mean, can't they? Is it necessary to deforest? I mean, we're service-based economies now. I mean, back in the day, it was all one of the reasons they do, for a variety of reasons. I guess a lot of things were made out of wood, right? And of course, they were, agrarian societies that came overpopulated, or more agrarian.
I mean, this is a big economy question, of course. But if you look at some of the, the top export products of Indonesia, in this case, it's oil and gas and palm oil. Right, and the world's demand for palm oil is growing and growing, and it must be said that in terms of like oil plants, palm oil is actually very, very productive. It provides a much higher yield per hectare than, rapeseed or things like that. So in principle, palm oil as a plant is a rather effective one. It's just the way that land is cleared and then manage the social conditions that are very, very problematic, the loss of biodiversity, of course. But, I mean, the fundamental problem is that we need these kind of rich ecosystems to, sequester carbon and so on, and, kind of intact natural reserves usually sequester much more carbon than like monoculture plantations. But okay, what would Indonesia export instead of palm oil and oil and gas? I mean, that is really the question.
Another thing I remember learning again a long time ago in economics was this concept of externalities, which basically, if you're polluting, you pay for it. If you're causing damage to the environment, pay for it. Palm oil is far too cheap. I know in business people are talking about tracking carbon emissions, ESG is the big thing, and so on. So as you can see, what damage has been done all the way along the supply chain. And we've talked about carbon taxes over and over again. I know in Australia it was a big thing, 10 years ago or so, and it never actually went through. But shouldn't there be some kind of mechanism where one of the problems with palm oil is it's so cheap, right? That we actually pay for the damage that we're causing.
That's right. But that's kind of, again, it's up to the food companies and us as consumers and it's not just the food companies. Palm oil is in household cleaning products, cosmetics, it's in half of the supermarket products,
fish and chips,
the consumables.
Government, I mean, again, government taxes things that are damaging, right? It taxes tobacco, for example. It taxes can't tax palm oil.
Yeah, but one interesting note, just when it comes to fossil fuels, like if you look at the US economy and like the stock markets, the stock market growth has been totally decoupled from the energy sector, which is largely fossil fuel based, a long time ago already, to the point that ExxonMobil was kicked out of the key indices. So I would say it is possible for economies to grow and prosper without being, fossil fuel dependent. Palm oil is a different topic as well, but I would go on and to say that it's possible to grow without palm oil, but just have to be inventive otherwise.
And we also need to look at solving the jobs, like how do countries survive if we say no to these industries. But the other huge issue we've got to deal with is corruption. It's a massive problem for many countries in this region. And
lack of transparency,
and greed, and I think another big issue is ignorance. For the people on the ground working who aren't necessarily connected like we are, they're just doing what they're doing to survive. I mean, we've seen a lot of backward steps in Africa with wildlife since the pandemic began, because a lot of what we created, the sustainable tourism, which attracted money and good jobs, sort of disappeared overnight. So what do people do? They go back to what they had to do to survive. So we've got it's all about sort of approaching it holistically. But the deforestation deal, the pledge, was signed by Canada, Brazil, Russia, China, Indonesia. We know that they walked back the next day. But there were some young people criticising their ministers on social media for doing that, by the way. The Democratic Republic of Congo, the US and the UK. And so that basically covers about 85% of the world's forests. It is seen as a significant step forward, but I think all of us have to really stand up and speak up, and we need to demand that companies that we buy from have deforestation-free products. So that's the palm oil, cocoa. There's so many, soy. There's rubber. So, and of course, but to do that, how do we get? So then we've got this other whole layer of the supply chain. So the companies that you buy work with a supply chain. So there hasn't traditionally been responsibility for the total supply chain. So companies are wiping their hands of what goes on further down the road, right? And so first of all, they've got to take total responsibility for the supply chain. And I think we need to, and we can do that. And we've seen great examples of companies, brands that have been destroyed because they've shown that they've got products or, like Egyptian cotton, it isn't Egyptian cotton, so it completely destroys the brand. So I think we're going to see forensic supply chain specialists. That's going to be a new career, and it's going to be a huge, huge industry, probably a dangerous one, who will basically be out there monitoring the supply chain for companies right across the industry. So I think that's something that's going to have to happen. Yeah. Technology will be a big part of that as well. So I think the supply chain is a big part of the story too.
Absolutely.
A lot of businesses are talking about that. I mean, I just happened to catch, I think it was the UK managing director of Accenture talking about how, they're working towards finding ways of measuring carbon footprints throughout the supply chain. So I think it's something a lot of organizations are certainly onto, and it's not, and again, they see money in it. It's not just because it's, they're not just doing it to be wonderful people. They see there's some benefit they can gain out of it. So, I mean, I think at the end of the day, sorry, Susanna.
So, just saying, SAP, the German software company, they have recently announced a carbon footprint, a product carbon footprint management software that would allow corporate buyers to actually know what's the carbon footprint of the products they're buying. I think quite early stage still for that product, but something like this, if a company with 88% penetration in the global supply chains can pull this off, that can actually have a very big impact, I think.
Yeah. And it's like things like the fashion industry, it's such a dirty industry. The consumer goods industry, it's deep and complex, but I think I feel, I've been talking about the supply chain responsibility for a very long time, but I feel that it's finally the lens is starting to go that way, and the businesses are starting to recognize that I think Disney got a really bad, had a brand image problem after the Bangladesh building collapse. Do you remember that? When a whole bunch of, and they left the country rather than staying and fixing the problem and the working conditions for women. So they left the country. So then a whole bunch of brands said, right, we're gonna do more, we're gonna do better, and the fashion industry is still terrible. But don't buy fast fashion. But yeah, I think the lens is finally there, and people are starting to get that bit.
Business perspectives, and we talk about it in technology, we talk about these paradigm shifts, but I think a lot of companies recognize that there is a move. It's slower than it should be, but a move towards renewables, and they want to be part of that.
Yeah,
right?
but it's also protecting. It's going to be about protecting the brand, because if you get linked into one of these stories, you can destroy your brand overnight. So. And if you're targeting younger consumers, more so.
I always feel sad, Andrea, after we see some scandal around one of the big oil companies. It doesn't seem to impact them significantly. They get a fine that, seems a huge amount, and then they continue on as normal.
Yeah, and I think it's more in the consumer industry.
Yeah.
I think that's where it's going to matter more. Shame will be part of the story as well.
Yeah. Public.
So just moving on, so we talked about India. They've made a commitment of 2070, which seems like an incredibly long way off, but it's the first time they've made a commitment. And so if they get the investment, so they've demanded $1 trillion in climate finance, to invest in the infrastructure that they need. So that number could significantly come down. China's also said 2060, and Nigeria has pledged 2060. So I don't know if you guys know this. Nigeria is going to be the third most populous nation on earth soon. So that's an important one. But one of the complications we've got with all of this country pledges is the rising nationalism. We're all in this together. We've all got to do it together. So, but the other industry that's really, really important to this conversation is the financial industry. So, Susanna, what have you been reading there as far as obligations from the finance industry? Because it's been a fairly feisty week on that front.
Yeah, so Mark Carney, so the former regulator from UK, who's been making quite a lot of noise about sustainable finance, announced that 450 firms representing 130 trillion USD of assets are now part of the so-called Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And so more companies have joined this pledge, as part of which the signatories commit to science-based guidelines to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, or actually they say mid-century, not 2050, and to also have 2030 interim goals. So I think one thing, first of all, to note about this is that some media outlets have put out the headline as if $130 trillion were now earmarked for sustainable development, but unfortunately that is not the case. So this really is the 130 trillion covers the assets under management of these signatories, although there are also some double counting questions and so on. Yeah. Nonetheless, yes, this is another pledge. It's it gives direction, but obviously, the financial industry plays a pivotal role, but to date has a quite questionable track record in actually taking climate action, in my view. So if you look at pension funds, also big names in the financial industry, in average, I read that 7% of all pensions would still be invested in fossil fuels. And then, we talked about the stranded asset risk. So I think this is a significant one for our pensions globally. And obviously, financial institutions are at a great risk of all physical climate risks. For instance, if you fund agricultural operations or trading and the yields are destroyed, whether it's by hurricanes or drought or rising sea levels, these risks will come back to the banks. So on one hand, I'm quite pleased with the development in the financial industry to actually start scrutinizing their risk positions better and also develop their policies. But it's still a long way to go. I think this week also some NGOs announced the winners of the fossil fuel funding banks. I can't remember which one was it, HSBC or Barclays, and they made quite some noise around that, giving them awards about, despite all this talk and policies, banks effectively.
I think it was BP.
Industry, right? Yeah.
Was that the one where they were showing there was a dance group? I think they had BP signs. Was that the one you were talking about?
I'm trying to remember which ones it was.
The protests have been interesting, but the other thing that keeps coming up, and Greta went after Carney over it, is offsetting, right?
Yes.
So offsetting is one of those things that just drives me nuts because we so for most people who don't get it, so rich countries go to poor countries and they pay for the offsets. So those countries aren't doing bad things, so they don't have to. They can offset against them. But then you've got a country like Russia, which has this huge forest, and because they have a huge forest, it offsets all of all the bad stuff that's coming out. So basically, we just every country on earth just needs to bring it down. We just need to bring it down. So offsetting isn't the answer, and it's actually looking like in a market that's going to explode, and it's actually what we don't need right now because it means you continue the behavior and you just offset it against somebody else who's not doing it.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously first of all there are two kinds of carbon credits which are associated with offsetting. So, for instance, the European Union has the carbon emissions trading scheme, the ETSI. So the European Union mandates that certain industries are only allowed to emit so and so much, And per ton of emissions that they're allowed to emit, they need to pay a price, and it's a traded price. So there's a market for this kind of carbon credits, and so countries that can effectively, sequester carbon or avoid emissions can actually sell such credits to such schemes as well. And then on the other hand, we have the so-called voluntary carbon markets where, countries or regulators do not mandate companies to buy these carbon offsets, but they do so voluntarily, mostly in the interest of, improving their image or pushing the guilt to the consumers, for flying, driving, whatnot. So if we look at the efficacy of such mechanisms, from historical data, we actually do see that in those mandatory carbon markets, such as the European ETSI, there's actually been emission reductions have been achieved. Somewhat moderate because of low prices in the past, but now those carbon prices are at record highs since months. So a ton of a carbon credit, offsetting credit on the compliance market in Europe is around 60 euro per ton. Whereas if we look at the voluntary carbon offsets that are sold, those start at like 5 euro USD per ton, aren't necessarily of very high quality. And this is where, companies justify their business as usual, saying, hey, by driving this kilometer, you paid 1 cent euro per liter. And now, we've offset it with a forestry conservation project in, I don't know, Uganda or somewhere. Yeah. And indeed, Greta Thunberg is criticizing this very heavily, Greenpeace as well. And to a degree, rightly so, because fact is we're putting over 40 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 equivalent emissions into the atmosphere a year. And the capacity to actually reduce carbon emissions or sequester more carbon, it's far less than that. So if you look at the IPCC scientists' work, they're saying that at maximum, under very favorable conditions, with good funding and, when everything goes right, by 2050, we might be able to offset 20 gigatons. Yeah. And still we're putting over 40 into the atmosphere. So I think what everyone really needs to understand that the capacity, at least with the technologies and types of things that we know today, is very limited. And even the 20 gigatons includes carbon capture and storage and stuff like that. That is not proven yet. So to think that we can offset our way to carbon neutrality is wrong in my view.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally agree. All right. So, any other thoughts of the week? I mean, I think what we should be doing is leaving everyone with a bit of hope. What do you guys think?
I was just thinking that same thing. I'm not sure where we're finding it, but good idea.
I mean, so to me, it was, look, people agreed to things that they haven't agreed to before. The world has woken up. Younger people they're angry. They're out there. I mean, even Greta Thunberg was swearing. Did you see that? She's using 4-letter words these days. She's a big girl. And please don't criticize her. She's an 18-year-old in the public eye. If I was an 18-year-old in the public eye, I would have sworn a long time ago. So I think the energy of the youth. And then I was talking earlier about the demographics. Like the younger people have got more power now, so they've got to vote. We've got to get out there. We've got to keep pressure on. We've got to not believe what we're reading. We've got to look between the lines. We've got to, and we've got to make sure that we hold the companies and the governments accountable. If we work for a business, we've got to get in there and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Become an environment champion within the business. But I think the energy is rising. We more people are aware now. I mean, we well and truly passed the tipping point of awareness. So I have hope in that, and even though a lot of old, I don't think anyone over 60 should be allowed to be in politics anymore. It should be everybody. It should only be under 60 because they're the people who are going to be impacted by this. But so that Boris Johnson would still get in, right? He's under 60. But yeah, I think we've just got to put all our energy and focus and contribute ourselves, do what we can do. Every single one of us has got to change our way of life.
I mean, maybe I'm being an optimist, but I think there will be I mentioned it earlier, a tipping point, because I think the cost of renewables has gone down and down, and the storage technology we're talking about is maturing super fast. So I think hopefully we'll get to a stage where those that are just feel they need to use this very old technology, that feel they have to go through the same process as these European countries went through, it'll just start looking like economic insanity, because it'll be more expensive as well as dirtier. So that's a kind of hope that I have from a power plant, and I think that's feasible. Just the amount of money that's going into renewables at the moment, I think it's not enough, but it's increasing. So I think there's a very strong chance that might happen.
And there's a lot of individual sort of billionaires, right around the world who are putting all of their focus into these really
Elon
important
Musk
areas.
could give that $1 trillion to India.
Yeah, but
Well,
Bill Gates obviously.
Actually, over a period of time, he probably could.
Yeah, but there's Bill Gates has obviously done a lot, and there's a guy in Australia who was he got rich off coal, but he's now turning it all around and turning them into, I can't remember what it is, but it was really, really promising. So there's lots of really good stuff like that. Sorry, Susanna.
Yeah, to me, I think what I'm taking away from COP26 so far is that these conversations are mainstream now. It may not feel like that in certain countries, but in most countries, these are the dinner table conversations. These are the conversations happening at workplace. The pressure is mounting, and we're not quite there yet, but we just have to keep going. And if anyone, the young people keep pushing us, and we have to keep going.
Yep.
And we will.
Yep.
We will. And I will add, I am always an optimist, but and I would say that for me, young people are so inspiring. I'm so glad there's a big shift, a huge shift in how they're looking at things. And I'm originally from the US. I've lived in Singapore for 23 years. I'm not sure. I'm going back to the US in a couple of weeks. I'm not sure if there's a tipping point of information there that enough people have gotten. I'm not sure how many conversations around the dinner table they're having. However, I'm going to get a sense when I go there. But I do know that, yes, this information is getting out in mainstream media, and there are climate events happening there that I think have been shocking in the last few years, and it will continue. And I think at some point, as I was saying, bring the outhouse in, it's not quite the same metaphor, but when you are actually experiencing it, then I'm guessing it'll seem a lot more real. So that's that and young people, totally there.
Yeah, you'll have to report back, and hopefully Murdoch's change of focus in Australia will be translated out to his other media assets, especially in the US, which I think would be significant. It hasn't happened yet.
Would be.
We need the advertisers in the US to demand it.
Yeah.
But I mean, if Fox News had a turnaround on climate, that would be a significant contributor, right? And the media is huge responsibility in this mix. Huge. So,
absolutely.
Anyway, so keep the hope alive. Make sure you vote for people that actually care. And we've go and solve what you can solve. If you've got a solution to a problem, get out there and get active. I've been reading a lot of very successful people are actually leaving their jobs and basically moving full time to work to save the planet. And I figure that's pretty much what I've been doing this year as well, right? Let's get out there. We've got no time to lose, and it's an opportunity to step up and make a difference. We can all do it, and we shouldn't just rely on the young people to do it. No. We shouldn't.
Great.
It's not right. All right.
Totally
Okay. I reckon we should go to the final bit, which is anything keeping you distracted at the moment other than the climate crisis, because it's been a really busy week. of trying to keep up with everything that's been coming out. So have you guys been paying attention? Have you looked at anything else? Podcast, book, anything? Yeah, Andy?
So I used to live in the state of Virginia, you may remember, Andrea. So I used to, well, basically Washington, D.C., so I lived just over the river. So I do take a keen interest in politics there, because it was about 20 years ago when I saw a change taking place, because it used to be traditionally very much a Republican state, but as the DC suburbs kind of expanded, it became more of a Democrat leaning state. And, there were changes going on, I think, in some of the other urban areas. It became more Democrat leading. So I was fascinated by the gubernatorial race taking place this week. I'm sure some of you other folks were watching it. And obviously, to me, there were some kind of unpleasant, depressing sides. But I tried to put up as positive a spin as I possibly could on it, which is that I think it may be the start of a move by the Republican Party to detach itself from Donald Trump, because the guy proved that with a big turnout, you couldn't argue. They couldn't talk about vote rigging or anything like that. So they got a big turnout, and this, is he moderate? He's not a Trumpite, right? Which I guess by Republican standards these days means you are a moderate, right? So so this guy managed to win by conventional means with a huge turnout and detached himself from Donald Trump. I mean, I don't agree with his politics, but nevertheless, I think it's. I don't know. I tried to put a positive spin on it. I was hoping he wouldn't, but I knew if he didn't, there'd just be, they rigged the vote, they were cheating, etc., and that all went quiet. So I was fascinated by that, because I think that might be the start of a change, or I certainly hope it is, but I think it might be the start of a change in Republican politics in the United States.
Yeah. Hopefully the Democrats wake up. They just don't seem to have the fire that they need.
Well, that's right. I think there's a problem there too.
Yeah.
But if you can beat them in policies, then you don't need to play these Trumpian games.
Yeah. All right, Cathy.
Same thing. Same. I was following that too, Andrew. And that's the only ray of sunshine I saw in that. He's stepping away from Trump, and hopefully others will see that they can win if they do that as well. The other thing I just sort of was looking at this week is it's not new, but it's in Afghanistan. Families selling daughters, like 9-year-old daughters, off to be married to 50-plus-year-old men, so that the family can eat. And it's a distressing turn of events. Not that it's new, but still. Anyway, I've just been following that.
And to be expected, right? Especially, I mean, the amount of children, young girls that have been sold in the last couple of years around the world. Yeah. And it's hard for us to understand, but yeah. All right, Susanna?
Yeah, I have a totally different kind of distraction. It's a thing called surf ski.
Oh.
Have you ever heard of it?
No.
I kind of figure it's been invented in South Africa also. So if you think of surfing, kayaking, and kind of mix that, something like that, I'm getting myself into. Quite interesting.
New addiction.
Yeah, there's the risk of that, I feel.
Nice.
Healthy outdoor activity, great.
Yeah, to get away from it all for a little while.
So
surf ski.
Surf ski. So it's like a surfboard with a sail on it, right?
It's actually more like what used to be called kayak, but now you don't call it kayak anymore.
Yeah.
But then you can kind of surf waves with that.
Yeah, I'm looking at images. Yes.
Yeah.
I want to see you
Like
flying.
a kayak.
Yeah. Well, so
Yes.
I finally got myself into Ted Lasso. Have you guys watched it yet?
Tell
So it's
about
on,
it.
the reason I didn't watch it is I couldn't find it. Anyway, it's on Apple TV, and it's just a really beautiful, meaningful. He's one of these people who's a realist, and he's positive, and he walks through the world making it people's lives better. But there's deep complexity to his character as well. And I just loved it. And if you want to have a break and you just want to watch, and it's really funny, it's very British, It's very it's
What's
based
it
around Ted Lasso, and it's based around. I mean, the female characters in it are absolutely sensational. Potty mouths abound, which I love. So yeah, if you're looking for a good distraction and you just want to sort of take your mind away, that's what I need to do sometimes. Yeah, it's really, really good. All right, so sorry, go, Cathy.
I'm gonna watch.
Oh, you definitely should. All right, we haven't got Tim and Joe here, so we're keeping it tight today, which is awesome. Only an hour and a half. But look, guys, thanks so much for coming. Susanna's going to join me next Friday, where we're going to do another wrap up with some other people because you two aren't available, but really talking about everything else that's going to happen between now and next Friday. But thanks so much for joining us, because I know that you're all really paying attention to what's going on, and Susanna especially, but Andy and Cathy, I've always admired the way you guys pay attention to what's going on in the world, and so I really appreciate you being here and coming back as well. So thanks, guys.
Great, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll see you next week. Come and join us. I'm going to upload this on the podcast on Common Courage as soon as I can. So if you prefer to listen to it on audio, it'll be there. And yeah, come and join us every Friday. We're just having a chin wag about what matters, and hopefully it helps people sort of just get up to date. So we'll see you next week. All right. Thank you.
See you guys.
Thank you very
See you,
much.
Andrea. See you.
Take care.
Yeah.